Good afternoon, followers and readers. This is Coco Mingolelli, and if you watched my first vlog here on Tumblr or Goodreads or YouTube, you know that I am the author of Peccatum and Carne. And today we're going to be talking about the importance of lesbian fiction written by lesbian authors and or queer fiction written by queer authors, because not all women ascribe to the label of lesbian, but it's still very important that these stories are told and by the people that have lived them, the people that have experienced them. With me today is our co-host of the day. This is Clark, and he is one of my co-editors, and I don't know how long he'll stick around and be cute for us, but yeah, say hi, Clark. I don't know how long Clark will stick around with us. He's pretty young. He's only about 8 months old now, maybe 7-8 months old, and he's one of the cats that we've rescued here, and but he's a permanent resident, so that's why he's my co-author. We'll get to the questions that you all sent in via submission or by anonymous in after we talk about the importance of lesbian fiction or queer fiction written by lesbian or queer authors. And I just want to preface the discussion with I was going to do a lot of research and, give everyone histrionics and research statistics and all of that stuff. But I feel like this topic is something that has to be taken personally, because I do take it personally. Being a queer pansexual woman writing, predominantly lesbian fiction, it is very important to me, because when I was growing up, I didn't have anyone in my, parents, families, or friends that were outward lesbians that ascribed to the lesbian label. I had a gay uncle, so I knew what gay was, and I knew that women that loved women existed, but I didn't really have an example of how to be or where to find people like me, or if I was a lesbian. And that took a while for me to realize, because of the lack of representation that there was at that time in history in the United States. We all love to talk about our favorite women-loving women ships, or our favorite TV couples, or our favorite movie couples now. And, in the 1980s, we didn't have that. Usually when someone was gay on TV, it was a big deal. And it was usually a very sad story of a man who was dying of AIDS, and a scare story, or some guy on Oprah or Maury Povich. It was not, mainstream America, and it wasn't always in a positive light. So when I was about 15, 16, I had an inkling that I was, more than an inkling, that I was a lesbian. And at that time, the only labels I knew were gay, lesbian, trans, bisexual. The word queer was just starting to be taken back by the gay community to mean something positive rather than something negative. So not a lot of people at that point used that label to self-identify. And pansexual at that time, I believe, was only a scientific term. So it wasn't this thing that it is now, where there's a lot of us around, even though we're kind of invisible unicorns. You can't really tell us sometimes, because we appear bisexual or demisexual, or any of the labels, depending on who we're with or who we're dating, or who we prefer to date, gender-wise, even in that, the spectrum of the genders that we're attracted to. So I was 15, going on 16, and I love to read. And one of my favorite things to do, that didn't really cost much money, was to go to a Borders Books and Music on like a Saturday and just get lost in the stacks and read as much as I could about things that interested me, which at that time were Star Wars and women. So my friend Heather and I went to Borders, and Heather was the only other girl in my class that I definitely knew for sure was either a lesbian or bisexual. So we went to Borders, and they had just opened up the gay and lesbian studies stacks. And, this was a very new genre at that point. And so they had all of the nonfiction with the fiction, and, dating advice 101 paired with the histories of the gay and lesbian community. So we would just grab as many books as we could, and go over to the cafe. And at that time you could do that in a bookstore without getting the side eye from too many cashiers, because as long as you bought a book every couple of days, they really didn't care that you took a look in the books and made sure it was something you wanted to buy, because books aren't cheap. And this was pre-ebook, pre the advent of e-readers like Kindle and Nook. So you had to buy the print books. So each one was between $10 and $40, depending on if it was paperback or hardcover. So the first book that I remember really identifying with, not so much the character's struggles, but the surroundings of the character, the setting that the book was placed in, was Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg. And I know that I'm speaking right now to, many generations of lesbians and queer women. This book is what I would consider from an older generation. Mainly people growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It just seems to ring true more for those generations. But it's still a very important book about, a very small but important part of lesbian history. And Leslie Feinberg brings to life the character of Jess. And Jess goes through, the many stages of life, starting out from childhood, not sure about her gender because she likes women, describing Jess's home life, describing the situation of a lot of girls or genderqueer people in that day and age, because Jess starts out identifying as a butch lesbian. And towards the later part of the book, Jess more identifies as genderqueer, but that's neither here nor there. The book is set in Buffalo, New York, which is very close to where I grew up and reside now, and it's only about 2 hours away. But the industries are very much the same. So Leslie Feinberg created this world that was very similar to the world that I already knew. And so I really connected with that book. And it made me think and remember a lot about things I'd done and places I'd been. For instance, in the book, they talk about, the unionization of labor and fair wages, and fighting for fair labor and fair wages, because Jess is a factory worker, mostly. And in Buffalo and around where I live, a lot of the industries revolved in that era around steel, apple picking and packing, agricultural stuff, paper, books, publishing. So we have a lot of factories around here, and New York is a state where we hate everybody equally. So it's a broad generalization. So when people are different, we generally don't care as long as they're a good person and they don't annoy us. People don't really judge around here. So we had an influx of women and genderqueer folk that worked in the factories. One of the several women that worked with my father at a steel mill was, she would walk the strike line with my father and I at 3 a.m., and we would walk miles on the strike line trying to get cars to honk people to sign petitions. And this would happen almost every year as the steel workers would fight for, their insurance, their benefits, and fair wages. And at the time, growing up, I didn't know that these women were any different except in their appearance. I didn't know what a lesbian was, and or how one was a lesbian. I was pretty young, though. I was, between 8 and 11 years of age. And then as I started to get older, I started to realize from overhearing conversations, if I went with my dad to the bowling team, or if, the men and the women were talking on the strike line about their spouses, about where the food was going to come from next. And the women would always mention their partner or their spouse, or sometimes even they were brave enough to say, in that day and age, their wife. So that book really resonated with me, Stone Butch Blues did, because it's very close to my personal history. And this brings us back to the original topic of why it's so important for lesbian authors to write lesbian fiction, and nonfiction too, is to make that connection with the younger generations and older generations, that might still need a boost coming out of the closet if they feel unsafe or they feel alone, or they're in a place in the world where it's still not safe to be openly gay or lesbian or trans. And so when there's more books available and they're written from a personal perspective or a perspective of respect, it is easier for readers to connect with the characters they're in. We see this a lot nowadays, and I see it on Tumblr a lot and on Facebook, where straight or heterosexual writers, or male writers even, regardless of their sexualities, will write lesbian characters. And it's almost always a very sad story by the end of it, or it doesn't last long, or somebody dies. And that's just heartbreaking to, people watching, thinking, is that all my life can be? Is heartbreak after heartbreak, or it's always going to end up in death, or loneliness, or something awful, something catastrophic. So that's why it's really important not just to write lesbian fiction or nonfiction, but to write the true stories, to write the stories that you are inspired to write from your own past, your own surroundings, your own professions. And that's what writers do. Writers take inspiration from the things around them, the people around them. And if it resonates with a writer, it most certainly should resonate with a reader, especially if that reader is, around the same age or of the same sexuality. Another big reason why I feel like it's important that lesbians write lesbian fiction is the sex. Sex is not easy to write. It's fun to write sex scenes. But for those that are writing it, if you don't know the schematics or the mechanics of doing so, you either have to research it a lot or have done it before. And if you're a straight man writing lesbian sex scenes, it's very obvious, very fast. As a kid, I had no idea what lesbian sex entailed. And it's not like I could, check out lesbian erotica or lesbian sex 101 at 16 years of age. They wouldn't have allowed it. So I would get my experience, as it were, from reading fiction books, lesbian fiction books. And if you know anything about lesbian history, a vast majority of those until about the mid-1990s were pulp novels written by straight men for straight men to get off their rocks. They're a very important piece in our history, and they're fun to read and they're fun to poke fun at, but they're not very accurate in their portrayal of lesbian sex at all, because it's from the male gaze, yeah. So they're fetishizing women and seeing women from a man's point of view, a male point of view. And it's different from a woman's point of view. Women pay attention to things that are much more definitive and small. The breaths a woman takes, the cadence of her moans, the volume, whether or not she's wet, whether she's aroused, or if, depending on the sex act that's going on in the scene, or the way of loving that's going on in the scene that the author is writing, there's certain things that are done that you would really have to experience to write. For instance, I remember reading a fiction book. I don't even want to say a novel. It was one of those like short, girl meets girl stories. And I thought that the author was a woman at the time. But it definitely wasn't as I started reading, because they described licking a G-spot. And while that is possible, it is very improbable. You'd have to have a really long tongue in order to do that. But as I was reading it, I had no idea, It's like, what is this magical G-spot that this person is talking about, and how do I lick it? And come to find out that that's pretty impossible unless you're, reptilian or have a very long tongue. And I'm sure that there are people that can do that, but a vast majority of us cannot. Or we see things like descriptions of women's bodies that just are so inaccurate. For instance, today there was a post on Tumblr about the author of The Witches of Eastwick, which actually I remember reading those books, and it never occurred to me that scene was in there, or that scene was weird or wrong, talking about one of the characters taking a pee. And he writes that it takes women a really long time to pee, apparently, because the pee has to find its way through our women bodies. Like, our setup is so very different from men's, or cisgendered men's, really, which it's not that different. There are differences, but the differences are that our bladders are actually smaller. So we actually have to pee more, typically. And while we can hold it for longer, we generally need to go more. And that's scientifically based. I did research that. It's the one thing I researched before today's vlog, because I actually responded to that post. But that, those types of thing, being genuine and being honest and presenting situations from a woman to a woman reader, especially those that love other women, is very important. Younger lesbians need to know that they can have a happily ever after, that not everything has to be doom and gloom and horrible, and that one of them dies always, or that their existences are always lonely or terrible or awful. We have stories like that that are based on true stories, or stories like that that are important to tell, where there is some angst or some horror or drama. But the important thing is that we represent these subgenres of lesbian fiction with honesty, and not with the idea that the consumer of the book is going to be instantly male. We're writing for each other. We're writing to tell each other the stories that we want to hear, and something that our readers can identify with, and use as support through hard times, or use as support to come out, or just to be able to open a book and say, wow, there's women like me, or there's other people like me. And I just think that with all of the misrepresentation that we've seen with the advent of gay and lesbian characters on TV, and queer baiting in some of the shows recently, that it's almost more important to then kind of up the ante, that we need to really start pushing for proper representation, accurate portrayal of women, not only as catty or stereotypical, that there's a whole multitude, a whole rainbow of women, and we're all different, regardless if we're lesbian. And we like to joke about how some straight people say, oh, well, Bob, you're gay. Do you know John? He's also gay. You must be friends. Or, Jane, you're a lesbian. You must know Maria because she's also a lesbian. And you must be friends. That's not the case. So that's, the more books that are written by lesbian authors for lesbian readers, is going to give lesbian readers a chance to find the books that speak to them, that educate them, that they identify with, whether it's a lesbian of color, Black, Asian, Native American, Filipino, the whole gamut, or a lesbian military member, or a lesbian cook. There's a multitude of ways to be a lesbian. So when I went in search of finding out what it was to be a lesbian, and how I should be a lesbian, and what does this all mean, who are we, when I went to go look for books when I was 16, I was lucky to find a book that resonated with me. I know that right now there are a lot of romance books that are strictly romance, and there isn't quite a dearth of lesbian fiction that's perhaps slanted a different way. I mean, it's always good to have a little bit of romance in books for entertainment's sake and because it's a part of life. But it's one of the reasons I really wanted to include an element of suspense and why I like to write psychological thrillers. Because reading romance is great, and I do have a lot of romance in my books, but you could read romance all day, every day, and it gets old. You want to know more about these women's lives, these characters' lives, than just the type of sex they like or the type of women they like to date. You want real world issues going on and real world solutions. So that's it for my own personal opinion as to why it's important that lesbian authors should write lesbian fiction rather than straight men writing it, or even straight women writing it. It's a matter of accurate portrayal and representation, and it's an issue that I'm glad to see my generation and the generations that are growing up between 13 and 18 years of age right now taking very seriously and fighting for. So I had asked you to send and submit some questions for today's vlog, and one of the questions that I received was what inspired me to write Peccatum and Carne. And I am going to be completely honest about this, 100%. Peccatum and Carne started out as fan fiction, as a lot of stuff does nowadays. A lot of great books start out as fan fiction. It started out as a fan fiction ship for Maleficent, between Maleficent and Princess Aurora for the newer 2014 live action Disney version. And that ship is very small. It has quite a few, very dedicated members. But I saw, when I logged on to read stories about it, because I loved fan fiction before Maleficent, was that there wasn't much writing going on yet. So I thought I'd try my hand at Maleficent fan fiction. I'd only ever written a little bit of fan fiction before, and very embarrassingly for Twilight, but neither here nor there. It was, a fairly popular ship for Twilight was Alice and Rosalie, and that was the stories that I like to write and follow. But with Maleficent, we saw that, you don't have to always have Prince Charming to have true love. You don't always have to let the sad events of your life, the torturous events of your life, you don't always have to let them win. Now, taking that into consideration, the movie was rated, I believe, PG, because this is Disney. We all know, well, I don't want to say we all know, but I want to say a vast majority of fans of the movie Maleficent know that the wing scene is a metaphor for rape, and that it was discussed in interviews with Angelina Jolie as to why that metaphor was very important. Beyond being an actress, Angelina Jolie is a humanitarian worker for the UN. For her specialty is providing support for women in war situations, especially those that have been sexually assaulted or traumatized. It's a subject that has resonance with so many women, unfortunately. Even outside of, war areas, we see every day in our culture in the United States and the world that women are assaulted sexually. Some scary statistics, 3 out of 10 women are assaulted every year. So if we had a grouping of 10 women in this room with me, 3 of them statistically have experienced rape or sexual assault in some fashion. So I'm really glad that that type of pain was shown in the movie in a way that was still appropriate for all ages to watch. But as a counselor outside of writing, I really wanted to take it to the next level. So Peccatum and Carne deals with a character named Mallory, who was originally written as Maleficent, a modern day Maleficent who has experienced sexual assault and basically cannot deal at that point in her life due to several mitigating circumstances. She doesn't have the support or the help to deal with recovery. She can't recover at that point in her life. She has no support. And in turn, she develops some very unhealthy coping mechanisms. And the book talks about that and about overcoming them with support. And mental illness is something that we like to say that we understand, that we comprehend, that we empathize with or sympathize with. But unless a person has experienced something like that or is knowledgeable in something like that, it's really hard to portray it correctly. And that was another one of your questions that was sent in for this vlog, and I'm going to explore that a little bit more in vlog number 3, which will be next week. Why it's so important to portray characters with mental illness, and not just portray them, but to give them honest floor time and to portray them in an accurate fashion rather than fetishizing them in any way or making them seem out to be the bad guy at all times, but also not making them out to be the good guy all the times. Book characters, like humans, are flawed. The good ones are well-rounded, and that means that they're flawed. Everybody is human, everyone errs, nobody is perfect. And that goes for people with mental illness as well. And in order to overcome mental illness, they need a full spectrum of support. Not only encouragement, but also people saying, I understand why you're doing this, I understand the behaviors that you're exhibiting because of XYZ, but that's unhealthy. And only then can recovery begin if they are ready to make that step. So we'll talk about that a little bit more next week, and we'll also have a drawing for the next paperback of Peccatum and Carne. I say the next paperback like it's a new edition. It's not. But I'd like to draw next week for folks to have a chance to win it, because I understand that a lot of my fans and followers here on Tumblr and on Facebook and YouTube are younger. And I understand what it's like to be going, through college and eating peanut butter sandwiches and ramen and, Easy Mac because that's what you can afford. So the idea of a $20 book is pretty out there. So I like to give opportunities for you to win. If you would like to be entered into the drawing, I need you to do one of three things. You can either message me saying, I'd like to be entered into the drawing. I can't like or reblog because my followers on my current blog wouldn't understand. Or I'd like to, just have a copy of it and I already reblogged your last vlog and, whatever, what have you. Or you can comment on this vlog with your own personal opinions on what we've discussed today. I really like to begin discussions, and it'll give me more to go on for next time. Or you can comment or reblog with your ideas about what you'd like to see next time or in the weeks to come. Past that, please do submit more questions. You can do so anonymously. I don't care if your usernames are on there or your real names or what have you. If you need to submit anonymously, that's fine. Regarding about what you'd like to see in my vlogs to come, what you'd like to talk about. So this is me signing off, and I'll see you next week. Bye.